Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. Publication details and the style of the novel. The novel was not printed in great numbers. The publisher originally undertook to print 350 copies. However, only 250 were ever actually produced. The quality of the printing was very poor and contained quite a number of misquotes and misprints. The book sold few copies, sadly, even of those 250, and received critically a rather mixed and moderate reception. Although it was, with those people who read it, it seems to have been popular, but critically it received a mixed reception. And Anne actually was revising and correcting the text at the time that she died. I think that Anne felt quite strongly attached to the novel of Agnes Grey. It is, for the period, a relatively short novel. It interestingly has a first-person narrative structure. It is perhaps harder in this novel than in many Victorian novels to separate the first-person narrator from the author. Often the narrative voice and the authorial voice are relatively distinguishable one from the other. Because of the semi-autobiographical nature of Agnes Grey, and also the evangelical principles that are expressed throughout the text, it is a lot harder to discern the differences between Agnes Grey as narrator and Anne Brontë as author. The writing style grows and develops as the novel progresses. Undoubtedly, Anne's writing skills increase as she moves through. And despite the very calm, collected, steady tone and pace of the narrative, the issues that are handled within the text are really quite complex. The characters are clearly delineated, and even today are probably recognizable types of people. Society has changed quite a lot since 1847. Nevertheless, I think that the characters are recognizable as individuals, but recognizable as well as types. There are lots of different circumstances that influence the characters in the novel. We see instances of how authority affects people, how the position of control affects people, how status affects people. We see examples of inclusion and exclusion in everyday social contexts, and again how this has a psychological impact upon someone. So Agnes herself is sometimes included and at other times excluded, and this can be quite arbitrary. It's to do with the whim and the selfish need of an employer or the child of an employer whom she's looking after. It's also to do with rudeness, plain and simple. We can see how this capriciousness has an effect upon Agnes. Mr. Weston, to some extent as well, can be excluded by those who regard themselves as being socially above him. And we see as well how he copes with that, what his strategy is. There are quite a number of incidents in the novel which help to illustrate authenticity in a character and insincerity in a character. Insincerity can manifest as pretentiousness, affectation, snobbery. Authenticity or sincerity can manifest as humanity, charity, love, affection. And these different situations are brought out and illustrated to the reader frequently through dialogue. There are lots of very revealing dialogues in this novel. And through the dialogues, through the situations in which the characters are placed, the way in which they handle those situations, a lot about their psychology is also brought forward. The genre within which the novel falls, slightly mixed, slightly blurred. It's a social cause novel. The social cause is to do with women's employment, to do with how governesses are treated. It might also be to do with, there might also be contained within it a plea for a broadening of fields and prospects for women. It's a didactic novel, as is sometimes called a Bildungsroman. It has sometimes been said that the characters don't undergo sufficient self-development during the course of the novel in order to render this fully a didactic novel. However, I think that that is part of the didacticism within the novel. I think that it was, in reality, very difficult for women who were employed as governesses to effect self-development. They were poorly treated, they were denigrated, they were often made to feel unnecessarily menial in their roles as governess. So, if Agnes doesn't develop particularly during the course of her employment career, this is not surprising, it's actually quite realistic. By the end of the novel, when she and her mother are working together in their own school, there seems to be a different and more developed air about Agnes. Mr. Weston as well is, so the clergyman, not the main clergyman, not good on these technical terms. Mr. Hatfield is the main vicar, and Mr. Weston is beneath him in the parish. Mr. Hatfield comes from a high-born family, a higher-ranking landed family. He understands fashionability and is much more superficially sociable and engaged with matters of etiquette. And as a result, he is more accepted and more included by the local gentry Murray family, by whom Agnes is actually employed. Mr. Weston comes from altogether more humble circumstances, and as a result is often passed over by the Murray family and the other bigwigs of the area. So again, in such a situation, although he is deeply steeped in his Christian faith, and although he is very well educated and very knowledgeable on theological matters, he is passed over because of his social position, irrespective of his position in the church. And again, it's difficult for a person to exhibit a great deal of self-development in those circumstances. Mr. Weston moves on to another parish, where he has more seniority. And again, he also emerges as a more confident individual right at the very end of the novel. This is also, as was discussed in the introduction to the novel, a semi-autobiographical novel. So that's also part of the genre within which it falls. Returning to the idea of didacticism within the novel, it's perhaps relevant to discuss the assertion of the novel that it is the truth. The opening line of the novel states, "All true histories contain instruction." As we know, this isn't entirely a true history. It contains autobiographical materials. It contains incidents that occurred in Charlotte's and Emily's teaching careers, but it's not entirely the truth. This is an interesting statement, I think. But clearly the author intends it to contain instruction, and perhaps the truth that she's talking about is the essence of truth that is contained in the types of interaction that she is described. She's trying to be truthful to the true social and psychological natures of the interactions that she's describing. Certainly, later again, although not so much later, in the preface to The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Anne Brontë writes, "As the story of Agnes Grey was accused of extravagant overcolouring in those very parts that were carefully copied from the life, with a most scrupulous avoidance of all exaggeration." So Anne continues to maintain the kernel of realism in Agnes Grey. Charlotte later again talks of this novel containing the mirror of the mind of the author. So at that level as well, it's a very truthful story and account. The critical reviews. As I mentioned earlier, the novel did not receive such glowing critical reviews. I'll quickly just quote two. This one comes from Douglas Jerrold's weekly newspaper, published on the 15th of January 1848. "We do not exactly assert that the author must have been a governess himself, to describe as he does the minute torments and incessant tediums of her life, but he must have bribed some governess very largely, either with love or money, to reveal to him the secrets of her prison house, or he must have devoted extraordinary powers of observation and discovery to the elucidation of the subject." I think that the reviewer is being ironical. I think that the reviewer strongly suspects, knows that the writer is a woman, and that the pseudonym Acton Bell is a red herring, suggesting that the author is a man, possibly. One other review to quote from is the Atlas, 22nd of January 1848. "There is a want of distinctness in the character of Agnes, which prevents the reader from taking much interest in her fate. But the story, though lacking the power and originality of Wuthering Heights, is infinitely more agreeable. It leaves no painful impression on the mind. Some may think it leaves no impression at all." So that really is damning with faint praise, and then just straightforwardly damning. One of the reasons that people may not have felt that Agnes left much impression on their minds was that governesses were by no manner of means regarded as interesting or romantic personalities or individuals at this period. It was quite daring to turn an undesirable individual, a dull individual, a poor individual, a lowly individual, such as a governess, to render such a person as the heroine of a novel. It was quite daring to try and make that person interesting to the Victorian readership. And unfortunately, as it would seem, Anne did not really succeed in this, because the print run was very low, it wasn't increased, there weren't very high sales. Nevertheless, the book has survived, and especially in the 20th century, started to gain a great deal more appreciation, people able to perceive its depth, perhaps because of greater distance from the social situations that it's describing. And also as an interesting testimony to the position and the life and the role of a governess in Victorian society.